Good Monday afternoon, and welcome Pastor Beatty,
Dave.
and welcome
Pastor
you
David.
to our weekly edition of Pastor, What Did You Mean? And this week, we could spend probably 2 or 3 hours on What Did You Mean as we look at the book of Job. We won't. We'll spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes, but there are just so many great questions surrounding this really wonderful book that, David, I've said to you, and I think I've said to many of you out there, I don't know if it's right to say a favorite book of the Bible. They're all favorites, but one that really resonates, one I enjoy spending a lot of time in. And so I was excited about this week, and so let's just get into it.
Well, that's interesting. First of all, you're the first person I've ever heard say that Job was his favorite
Oh,
book. Is it because of the beautiful language, the poetic language, or something else?
Oh, I think there's several layers to it. One is I think it's the most beautifully written book in the entire Bible in terms of the way it moves from a narrative in the first 2 chapters to this poetry between chapters 3 and 41 to conclude with a narrative. But the poetry, there's all these scales of parallelism and the debates that rage, the cycles of poetry. But the creation tour, to me, in chapters 38 through 41, I think we could do a 12 to 15 week sermon series on those 3 chapters alone. And then I also think that, and I think we'll get into it maybe with some of your points, I think Job is just brutally honest with the idea that it's not really ever about why we are suffering, but how we live in our suffering. Right. And that God is God and we are not. Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, that's really what we learn in Job. And I think it's humbling, and yet I think it's highly encouraging. But this isn't about what did, but that's a great question. But thank you for that. Yeah, because I do know that we moved from maybe my favorite to next week your favorite.
The book of Psalms. That's probably right.
Yeah,
probably right.
But given Job, so one of the things we did this week, if you've been with us our entire one-story journey, is we've spent the first part of the year in the 17 books of the law and history.
Right.
And now we've transitioned to these books of poetry, wisdom, and prophets.
Right.
And so Job is the first one. And really what we have is between Genesis and Esther, we have the history of the nation of Israel.
Right.
However, creation to about 400 BC. The books of poetry, wisdom, now we just sort of overlay into these periods of history for different purposes and reasons. So as we begin, how do you explain, where are we in Job? Where would you place us as far as
time?
When does it, in time, when does it happen? When is Job written? Or?
Frankly, I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't seen it written in a study Bible exactly, but people estimate, some say around the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, on to the time of Moses. Some suggest that Moses even was the author of the book.
Yes.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
But that's what I've heard.
Yeah, and from my study of Job, it would seem that it tends to lend itself to sort of that dating within the patriarchs that, again, around Abraham, the land of Uz was apparently nearby Midian, which was the home of Jethro and Zipporah, Moses' wife and in-laws, and that some of the language, the original language, is really both sort of that timing, that dating, as well as some Egyptian influences that might have occurred in it. But relatively speaking, we don't know for certain. We just don't know. And but we know that we know that it took place. But let's just jump into perhaps the elephant in the room question around Job, and it really came from talking with several of our members, and one specifically, Edgar Warren out there had a great question this week and just came out and asked, is Job a parable or is it historical fact?
I say it's historical fact.
Okay.
I think you have to be careful if you say a book like Jonah or Job is merely a parable. It's a slippery slope to the way you interpret Scripture. So I see it as historical fact. And a few reasons for that. Number one, in the book of Ezekiel, God is speaking when he is talking about the judgment that's going to come upon people for their sin. And he said, even if Noah Daniel and Job were here, they would save only themselves by their righteousness. So Job is treated as an historical figure
Right.
along with the other two.
Right.
And then James, in the book of James chapter 5, is talking about suffering. And in James chapter
right.
5, I think it's verses 10 and 11, he says, "My brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." And then he says, "You've heard of the patience or perseverance of Job and seen what the Lord finally brought about." That is the way he blessed Job in the end of things. So I think Job is there being lumped with the prophets, really.
Sure,
And
okay.
I believe that when Job speaks on a few occasions, he's speaking prophetically.
Okay.
Like in Job chapter 9, he says, "Oh, that there were an arbiter between us, a mediator." And it's as if he's calling out for, the role of Jesus. And then in Job chapter 19, one of my favorite verses of the book,
Okay.
he says, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the end he will stand on the earth. And when my flesh is destroyed, yet I will see
Yeah.
God." And so, to me, obviously he's inspired by the Holy Spirit.
Right,
If he's speaking
right,
of Christ,
right.
and I think he is. So for those reasons, I think it's
Yeah.
an historical book that actually took place.
Yeah, and it seems that the only reason that there would be sort of a leaning toward parable is, one, because of its literary style, that it is sort of a poetic / wisdom literature.
Right.
And those at some point had been known to sort of cross over. And then the opening with the council that God is holding,
God and Satan.
and the adversary appears. So that would be the reason why, but I agree with you that it seems to be a historical figure. But so given that, how do you address that counsel that God's having? Why do you think God allows the adversary to interrupt and disrupt?
That's a really good question. That, I think, for many people is the biggest question about the book of Job. What is happening when Satan comes with the, quote, sons of God, who I think would be the angels,
Right.
appearing before his throne, and God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" When does it take place? Does Satan still have access to God's throne today? He's called the accuser of the brethren. The short answer is I don't know, but I think it is literal, not just figurative, language. And I think that personally, the book of Revelation, chapter 12, speaks to Satan being cast down,
Okay.
the accuser of our brethren. I think it's in Revelation chapter 12. And for much of Revelation, it's difficult to know when it takes place, but the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who's the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And the next verse reads, "I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, 'Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come.'" So I think this is sometime after Christ had gained his authority through his death and resurrection. "For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God." So just my
That may be
own
part of that.
opinion, he's not, he's been thrown down to the earth.
Okay.
And he's warring against the saints.
Yeah.
He's still our adversary, he's still the accuser of the brethren, but the authority of Christ has come. And Satan has stripped him of his power.
Okay.
Satan has been stripped of his power by Christ.
So that so the next question that might be is, can that still occur today? Can the adversary, can Satan still come before God and be sort of speak into, persecuting believers as a test before God? Or do you feel like the standing before God is no longer?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I would say no.
Yeah.
He does not have the same access today. Jesus has spoiled principalities and powers and made an open show of them. He represents us as our high priest before the throne of God. What business would Satan have accusing us with Jesus there? So I don't know, but that's my opinion, is that he does not have access to God's throne as he once did.
Sure. Okay.
Just opinion.
Yeah. Well, that's always an interesting
Yeah.
part to study of Job as well. So sort of now back to big picture then. You spoke of three things yesterday that we can learn, what Job tells us. Can we learn from Job? And you spoke about that in suffering we can learn to know God better and to trust Him more. You also spoke about the perseverance in our faith, the steadfastness even in our suffering. But if you had to boil it down to the big idea, what really is the big idea of Job? If I'm trying to convince someone else of why it should be their favorite book, I've got my thought, but what is the big idea of Job?
Well, to put it somewhat negatively, I would
Sure.
say the futility of trying to understand God without God revealing himself to us.
Yes.
But in a more positive light, the awesome greatness of God. And
Yeah.
it puts everything else in a different light when
Yeah.
you get a vision of that. And you read chapters like chapter 38 where God's talking about the constellations. And were you able to, put the Pleiades in its place and all this sort of thing?
Yeah.
You get this idea of his vast, awesome power. So our little human questions about suffering are just seen in a different light.
Yeah.
So the bigness of God, if I were
That's
to put
right.
it in one phrase.
Well, and so the question to Job from God through this whole tour is, when he takes him from the foundations of the earth and creation through the creatures,
Right.
even to the most magnificent of all, is can you do that?
Yeah.
And if you can't, then how can you question what I'm doing in your life? Don't you trust me enough in all of creation to know that you can trust me with your life?
Right.
And that is very encouraging to me, I think, despite its, again, very humbling sort of piece to that. And so, because, a lot of times we think, well, Job is all about patience. And it's really not. Or why do we suffer? Why does man suffer? And that's not it at all, is it?
Doesn't answer the suffering question.
Not at all.
Of course, James commends Job for his patience
Right.
and so forth, but no, neither of those is the main idea of the book, I don't think. It's almost synonymous with suffering. In patience, we hear people say, oh, that person's got the patience of
Right.
Job. And when you read the book,
yeah.
he doesn't seem all that patient, really.
He does it. And,
But yet, he's given us as an example of one who is.
right.
But
he-
neither would be the main theme.
And he perseveres. He's steadfast.
perseveres.
He may be impatient at points, but I do like the rendering steadfastness. I do love the rendering
Yeah.
perseverance, that even if he was impatient in moments or really accusatory of God, making claims against him, and retribution theology, trying to sort of his friends influencing him that maybe I did sin or I didn't sin, but that ultimately he continued loving God.
Yeah.
And I think that was the steadfastness that eventually, as we continue to love, we're in our humanity, we're going to question, we're going to be disappointed, hurt, possibly bitter at times, but continue to persevere,
Right.
steadfast in our suffering. And so, one other question concerning, again, this whole idea about Satan before God. Psalm 121, I believe 121:7 speaks about, I will not harm you, or I will not, let you harm me, or any of the other. Jeremiah 21.
You will not let your foot be moved. or
Let your
something
foot
like
be
that.
moved. And Jeremiah, that the fact that, I will prosper, plans to prosper you, not to harm you. And yet it seems like in this case that God did harm. And of course, we are harmed in our suffering. How do you reconcile?
Well, you have to look at things ultimately, I think, with an eternal perspective.
Yes.
And ultimately are good. Is it true that God is able to cause all things to work together for our good? Because he has predestined us to be conformed to the image and likeness of Jesus. Those can be difficult verses when you're going through suffering. They really can. And I don't think they mean we shouldn't pray for an end to suffering. You know, James, the book of James says, anyone suffering, let him pray.
Right.
If you're sick, call for the elders. Let them anoint him with oil and pray the prayer of faith. But at the same time, ultimately, you know, here's where I think the book of Job teaches us. A lot of these questions are simply not answered.
Right.
But call us to a greater grasp of who God is, the bigness of God.
Yes.
And
And the,
so, yeah.
the wisdom. Well, let me ask you one final question. Because Job is such a diverse book. I mean, you could be in one section of it, and then a few chapters over, you know, it'll be something totally different in style and content and everything. I think you mentioned this earlier with either 9 or 19. Do you have a favorite passage within Job that you go to?
I love that place where Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives.
19. Okay.
And it's in chapter 19. And if there's a favorite verse, it might also be chapter 42, verse 1, where Job says to God, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted.
Yeah.
And that's a comforting verse, that no purpose of God can be thwarted or defeated. And so I find those both really encouraging verses.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you the other part to Job that I really like is because I feel like sometimes I really need to hear this, is right before that when God rebukes Job for his accusations and all. Basically, he says, you know, stand up and be a man. You know, look, I'm going to talk to you. You're going to listen. And then Job says, I'll cover my mouth. I spoke and I shouldn't have spoken. And I think that's always sort of a human thing to see. But then Job 28. To me, Job 28 is one of my favorite poems of all. It's right in the middle of this book, and it really seems to be out of place, but at the same time, it seems to be an intermission to these cycles of debates. And it's really a poem about where can wisdom be found. And it says we search and search and search in our materials, in our environment, in creation, we search. We can't find wisdom. But the Lord says that He made it, He did all these things, and that the fear of Him is wisdom, and to shun evil is understanding. And it's a wonderful, Job 28, 1 through 28. If you get a chance, it's a great poem, and I think very convicting as well, and very wisdom, God's wisdom. Well, anyway, well, thank you.
Beautiful.
David, is there anything else on Job?
No.
Okay.
No. I just think it's a rich and beautiful book of the Bible.
Yes. And
It really should take 10 or 12 weeks to study a book like that.
That's right. Even the Behemoth. Again, I think 10 weeks on the Behemoth in chapter 40 would be wonderful. But next week, like I say, book you just know well. You love to teach, the Book of Psalms.
I love the Book of Psalms.
And so, what really a wonderful, fitting way to address Mother's Day on Sunday. I think with the Good Shepherd, and that the Lord is our shepherd. And speaking of Mother's Day, all week, Monday through Thursday, 10 to 5, we would love for you to come by. We're going to have Communion Sunday. We've got communion cups to give out. We also have something special for really the ladies of the house to hand out. We have the One Story Volume 2 books you can pick up. They're complimentary. And maybe a few other goodies and some activities for the kids. So we look forward to seeing everybody come by Monday through Thursday through the drive-through, and we will stay and put that in your car or whatever you need. But until then, we will see you next Monday at 2:45 with Pastor, what did you mean? Have a great week.
Thanks, David. Thank you.